To discuss this and more, I am joined here today by Elizabeth Wathuti, a Kenyan environmentalist and climate activist. Welcome. We also have Lee White, the Environment Minister for Gabon. Please welcome to the stage. And we were supposed to be joined by Victor Kabengele, the Deputy National Coordinator of the Red Funds of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but he apologized and would not be able to make it. But we will have this discussion and more with our panelists here. Thank you so much for joining me. And Liz, I want to start with you. You've done a lot of work and campaigns, particularly in Kenya, around tree planting initiatives or a lot of activism around stopping governments from cutting trees. Could you talk a little bit about your journey and your experience in that field?
Yes. For a long time, we have heard about the importance of nature, but we've also seen how much there's a disconnect between recognizing that nature is our own life support system, and nature is everything that surrounds us. So for me, trees really represent our life support system, and it is important to acknowledge the need for us to protect nature and also regenerate the degraded forest lands. And we see a lot of tree planting initiatives around the world, but for most of them, there hasn't been a recognition that at the same time, we also need to protect what already exists. We need to protect the forests and the remaining natural ecosystems around us for us to also achieve the climate targets. So part of the initiatives that I run include working with school children in Kenya through the Green Generation Initiative. And this is an initiative that aims to get children to appreciate nature, because when you appreciate nature, when you love nature, you will do everything that it takes to protect nature. And this initiative also focuses on addressing food insecurity, because the children are able to grow fruit trees around their own school compound in a way that these trees also benefit them. They provide something nutritious for them to feed at the end of the day. But also the children are demonstrating that we need to stop just planting trees, but grow and make sure that the trees have grown up to maturity through this campaign that we dubbed Adopt a Tree campaign, to get every child in every school to plant and adopt a tree each in their own school compound. But also I like to mention that these same children are trying to make a difference. They're trying to clean their own air, to grow their own food, to green their own school compounds. But it's the same children who look beyond their school borders and they see big businesses and corporations and governments cutting down much bigger ecosystems and deforesting lands. And this is undermining their very efforts. And that is why, for me, it's really important to also hold leaders to account and fight for the protection of existing ecosystems, so that this is about collective action and everybody needs to make a contribution to it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Lee, oil accounts for about 39% of Gabon's economy. And recently, my colleague Dion actually spoke to you about how Gabon is now looking to generate more revenue from logging. Could you talk us through some of that strategy and how it's going?
Sounds bad when you say it like that. We're going to go from oil to killing trees. You're right. Gabon is a country which has for a long, long time depended on oil revenues. We're very conscious that over the next 10, 20, 30 years, those oil revenues will disappear. Whether we want them to or not, the world is going to stop using hydrocarbons for other than specialist uses. And so that creates a serious problem for Gabon, which is how do we balance our economy? How do we develop our nation? How do we create jobs for the young people? We have a small population, so we're a country the size just bigger than the UK, but we only have 2.5 million people, of which half are under 20. We have 400,000 jobs in our economy today, and we have 800,000 people in school. And that doesn't go. That's a recipe for destabilizing the nation in 5, 10, 15 years. So we have to create jobs for our young people. in a context where we're going to lose our oil economy, and I'll say it in a slightly aggressive way, we're going to lose that economy because the developed world and the G20 nations have filled our atmosphere up with so much CO2 that Gabon will not be able to sell its oil in the future. We have another constraint, which is very serious. We are 88% rainforest in Gabon. We're the second most forested country on earth, behind Suriname. We're part of the greater Congo Basin, which stores almost 10 years of global emissions. So if we cut the Congo Basin forest down, we lose the fight to keep 1.5 alive. We lose the fight to keep 2 degrees alive. We're heading about for a 3.5 degree world. That's 7 degrees in Timbuktu. That's the Sahara Desert racing to the south. And in addition, our rainforests are linked by what we call atmospheric rivers that send rainfall to the Sahel, that send rainfall to Ethiopia, that fills the Blue Nile and irrigates Egypt. So Congo Basin is linked to Egypt. If we cut our forest down to replace our oil economy, we'll be killing people, literally killing people in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, even in Egypt. Because in Africa, climate change is a life and death situation for many people, and our rainforests buffer that. So what do we do? How does Gabon provide jobs for all of those young people? How do we replace our oil economy in a country that's 88% rainforest without cutting the trees down or without destroying the forest? Well, our model, and I appreciate the fact that Dion took the time to understand, because we hear so many very simplistic arguments about Congo Basin and forests. The way we do forestry in Gabon, which is very different to the way you do it in the US or Norway, is we do what we call selective logging. We pluck out 2 trees on average per hectare. So in an average hectare, there are about 600 trees in Gabon. So we take 2 of the 600. We do cause a bit of damage in doing it, so we lose about 60 trees, about 10% of the forest when we log. We then don't touch it for 25 years. So we leave the forest to grow back. We use nature-based solutions to regenerate the forest. So we protect the elephants and the gorillas and the monkeys and the hornbills. And so the wildlife replants the forest. And if you monitor that over 25 years, as we have with carbon plots, at the end of 25 years, your forest has more carbon than it had at the beginning. Its biodiversity has changed somewhat. So in our vision, we are setting aside 30% of our lands as protected areas, parks, community forests, sanctuaries, whatever, to preserve the part of the biodiversity that suffers when you do forestry. The very sensitive understory plants and animals that need the shade and the humidity of the rainforest suffer a little bit when you log. So we protect them in our protected areas, and we're assigning 60% of our country as sustainable forestry concessions, where we're managing sustainably. The law obliges companies to manage sustainably. We're managing in a carbon positive manner. We banned the export of logs from Gabon. There was a picture of logs when we came in. For 110 years, starting in 1889, Gabon exported logs to the developed world, mostly, the emerging world. The first export was to Germany, to Hamburg. When we export a log off the African continent, it's the classic tragedy of Africa. We are considered just to be a source of cheap raw materials. by the outside world. So when you export a log from Gabon to Hamburg, it's 8% of the value of that log stays in Gabon. And 92% of the value of that log is realized in Germany. We create 1 job in Gabon, and they create 9 jobs in Germany. France, the colonial power in Gabon, used to have a lot of logs going from Gabon to France. When President Bongo banned the export of logs, President Sarkozy showed up 2 months later to tell him it was a big mistake. But it was a big mistake for all the factories around Honfleur, which are now out of business. Yeah. It was a big mistake for the jobs that existed in France. But in Gabon, since he made that decision, our forest economy has increased by a factor of 4. The number of jobs in the forest economy by a factor of 3. And by processing the timber in Gabon, mostly in industrial areas, in sort of peri-urban industrial areas, because our population is 87% urban in Gabon. We have a very low rural population. We create jobs for those peri-urban, those urban young people who otherwise would not have jobs. And our vision is that if we can get to the point where we're transforming all of this selectively harvested timber, so maintaining the forest, but selectively harvesting, into finished products, into tables, chairs, parquet floors. And if we can convince the outside world, because they're already starting to boycott our tropical timber, because we're considered to be corrupt, and we're considered to allow illegal practices, and people think we're massacring all the wildlife and so on. But if we can convince the world that when you buy a table from Gabon, first of all, there's traceability, so it's legal. Second, it's sustainable. Third, it's carbon positive, so climate positive. Fourth, and as an example, the African elephant is a very good indicator of environmental governance. Countries that have lost their environmental governance, have lost their elephants. Almost all countries that have had civil wars in Africa lost their elephants beforehand. So the elephant's an indicator because of the value of the ivory. Well, in Gabon, whilst we've lost 2/3 of the forest elephants of Africa in the last 15 years to poaching, our population has gone from 60,000 to 95,000. So if you buy my table, it's an elephant-positive table. It's a biodiversity-positive table. And it's creating jobs for the Gabonese people. So you're investing in improving livelihoods in Gabon and enabling us to transition, as you just said, from the oil economy to a sustainable economy based on natural resources. And the key thing is transforming the natural resources on the continent, so the value stays in Africa and the jobs stay in Africa.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to ask you about this, in the new ways in which this new conversation with the West and in Africa, particularly in light of the war in Ukraine. But I wanted Liz to respond to that. Like, when you hear governments or ministers outlining visions like this, bringing people out of poverty and economic development, particularly by logging or by cutting trees, what comes to mind, and what has been the conversation around that in the past?
I think we have had a lot of conversations on the same. And just 1 year down the line at COP26, we had about 145 countries that represent the 90% of the world's forests making pledges to strengthen their efforts to protect forests. And 1 year down the line, I think we haven't seen any serious follow-ups on the same, and clearly also not so much transparency, and as well as finances to be able to scale up some of these efforts and strengthen them. And for a long time also, when it comes to forest degradation, we have so many factors that are linked to deforestation. And in many cases, the issue always goes back down to communities around the forest. But we also fail to mention other factors, such as the issues of fossil fuels investments. And we really know that for us to keep 1.5 alive, we have to stop investments in fossil fuels, because they're also in a great way fueling deforestation. And for example, in the Congo Basin, we know that part of the blocks have been auctioned for fossil fuels, and this is really a really big risk for the climate, a big risk for nature, but also at the moment, we do have an opportunity to make change happen because we are just a few weeks away from the Biodiversity COP, which is actually a once-in-a-decade opportunity for nature. And what leaders actually need to be part of that biodiversity conference as well to make real targets and changes for nature, because we need sufficient targets as well, and we need a lot of transparency and also massive investments in some of these efforts to scale up and strengthen investments in nature, which we're not seeing. So I think the recognition that there is an interconnected crisis that we are in right now, the climate crisis, the nature crisis, the food crisis, and then really remember that this is about our people and the planet. Because the same people who are living on the continent that has done the least to contribute to this crisis are the same people that are paying the price for this crisis. And we have seen from the impacts on what is happening across Africa, from the ongoing prolonged drought that has seen over 20 million people across the Horn of Africa facing climate-related starvation. We have seen the devastating floods affecting West and Central Africa. And these are not just numbers, these are people's lives and livelihoods that are at stake. So it tells us that we have to really ramp up and really take this crisis seriously, and also make sure that we are massively protecting nature and protecting the people on the front line.
Mm-hmm. You've, part of like the campaigns that you did in Kenya was about stopping the cutting of trees in urban areas, particularly in Nairobi. One of the things that, when we spoke a couple of years ago was you talked about environmental justice concerns that are particularly linked to these logging practices. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. In a huge way, when it comes to environmental protection and also climate justice, we say this is about social justice. This is about protecting the people who are on the front line of the impacts of the actions that are happening today. And also with the campaign on the trees in the cities, because I do recognize that every sector of the economy needs to decarbonize, and every person and every government, every institution needs to be a part of the contribution to make changes happen. And that's the same with every city, because we need to make sure that we are protecting trees in our forests and also making sure that our cities are also clean, green, and resilient. And that is why, for me, some of these campaigns to protect urban green spaces are also really important, because it's in the same cities where we are facing the crisis as well of air pollution. And these are challenges that continue to affect the young generation, to affect the children. And we cannot really ignore some of these impacts if we are really serious about making sure that this is about the people and that this is about the planet. So this is about justice, because the people that are being affected, and there's so much that is at stake if we don't ramp up our efforts and contribute to making things change right now. And most often, the conversations should actually be about people. And because if we're not doing this for the people, then it's actually pointless, because justice means making sure that we are taking the needed steps right now to save the lives and livelihoods that are at stake. And it also means that the leaders have to make sure that any pledge that has been made before is actually fulfilled, because we've seen how much we are seeing a repeat of the pattern in most of these forums that are happening. And the patterns are whereby leaders will come to international platforms and they make commitments, they make pledges on what is going to happen. But the moment we leave these forums and get back home, then the steps that are supposed to be taken do not happen. So there's need to be a lot of effort scaling up also in countries whereby people are pushing for some of these efforts. And we also need to recognize that communities and young people that are on the front line are not just sitting back. They are the people that are leading so many initiatives on the ground to scale up reforestation efforts, to scale up the protection of forests and protection of trees around their cities as well. And for me, this is really what it means to show what real climate action looks like. It's not really waiting to see who takes the first step. It's actually stepping up and doing it. But also we need to see a lot of efforts when it comes to investments in nature, and that is why some of these forums are really important, but they're only going to be meaningful if actually it translates to real action back at home once the leaders are out of the conferences.
Yeah. Lee, do you want to respond to that, particularly around how you engage in communities on this strategy that you have?
I can do that, but I was going to applaud. I mean, we need real action. I mean, there has to be real action. I think I can safely say, I sometimes feel that I work for an activist, that my president is a climate activist. He has been to multiple COPs, he's made commitments, we've respected those commitments. Today we think, the most carbon positive country on the planet. We're net absorbing a quarter of the UK's annual emissions. We're absorbing 100 million tons, just over, net, across all sectors. So even that oil that you said is fueling our economy, we decarbonize it at source. There's no emissions that come from Gabon. We decarbonize our entire economy and then some. And so we've achieved the Paris Agreement. We've gone beyond the Paris Agreement. And we're probably the only, or one of the very few countries whose NDC is a commitment to remain carbon neutral forever. Yeah, we've made a commitment, almost unconditional commitment, to remain carbon neutral beyond 2050. And a conditional commitment to continue to absorb over 100 million tons per year, if we can. But we need action. We need investment in the sustainable development of the African continent. So we have to get away from this model that you take, let's say you take the minerals out of the DRC and you build the electric cars in America. No. You should build the electric cars in DRC and create jobs and stabilize that country and help that country to thereby stabilize its forest cover. Because the poor rural people who are cutting the forest down in DRC, your 500,000 hectares, on average, let's say on average a family cuts about a hectare to farm. And on average, they make about $150 in a year from that farm. And on average, if carbon dioxide's only worth, if a ton of carbon's only worth $10, on average, they've done $5,000 of damage to our global climate in order to earn $150. Well, if REDD+ was real, if the commitments, as you said, if the commitments were real, if the developed nations were honoring the kind of the REDD+ carrot they've been dangling in front of tropical nations for the last 15 years since Copenhagen, then there would be a way to give those people a better life for not cutting the forest down. We could do an agricultural revolution in the Congo Basin and move from shifting cultivation, which is something that was invented 600 years before Jesus. It was invented 2,600 years ago. We would be doing modern agriculture in the Congo Basin. It would be carbon positive. It would be 20 times more productive. And those people would have livelihoods and health and education. And it would be easy to do if only the developed world would honor its commitment to REDD+. Very, very simple. Gabon, sorry, I'm deviating from your question, but Gabon, during this week, will probably see 90 million tons of REDD+ credits for Gabon posted on the Lima hub of the UNFCCC. Rather than applaud Gabon and saying, well, that's great, you've reduced your emissions, you've become even more carbon positive, we're being criticized because we risk flooding the carbon market. Little Gabon risks flooding the global carbon market. All that goes to tell us is that the global carbon market is not fighting climate change, and we need to change something. Now, if we do manage to sell those credits, so I come back to your question, then as I said, we're 87% urban, our population. So Gabon's a slightly unusual country. If you go to DRC or even Congo, you'll find more rural people. But we're making a commitment our sovereign fund, which is the fund for future generations of Gabonese people, is being given those credits to commercialize. So my ministry created them, but I hand them off to the sovereign fund. Everything they invest in is for the future of the Gabonese people. And we're putting into our finance law rules that will ensure that a proportion, a greater proportion than just the number of people that live in rural Gabon will be invested in improving the lives of rural people in Gabon. So we're trying to make sure that if we manage to sell these REDD+ credits, if the developed world respects the engagement made in Copenhagen to do this REDD+ process, then you know, the Gabonese people will all get their fair share of this revenue, and the revenue will be used to invest more in creating more carbon credits, so better managing the forest, invest more in the quality of life for rural people that live next to the forest and in the forest. And so we're trying very hard to put in place the governance that we need. You know, it's integrated. If the people are not happy, then and if they don't value the forest, why would they keep the forest? Why would they preserve it? If the nation is not making money from the forest, why would the nation choose to keep the forest instead of turning it into cocoa plantations? And so those are the dynamics that we have to deal with as government.
Great. I would like to, we have a few more minutes. I'd like to open to the audience. There's a question here. Could we get a mic here? And then there's a question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Naomi. And in terms of reforestation, I've been thinking a lot about organizations like REDD and more widespread global initiatives for reforestation. And I guess the main issue I see, or that I've been researching, is kind of the impact on local communities with such a widespread policy. So for example, like the Rufiji Delta in Tanzania, there was a whole initiative that happened for the mangrove forests to reforest them, in which they relocated local people who've been native to the land for millennia, and kind of forced them out of the area, even like not really accounting for forest-reliant communities. And I think this happens often where in order to instate a successful policy, local communities are often disregarded. So I was wondering how we can see an impactful and successful approach to reforestation that is also considerate and ethical towards local communities.
Do you want to take that, Liz?
Yeah, I would respond to that in two ways, and one of them is that we know that if we have shared benefits with the communities and recognize that the communities also deserve to live their lives, and they are communities that are trying to have food and water for their family and for their children, and in recognition that these communities also deserve incentives around their fight in protecting this forest. And therefore, even when it comes to the wider global communities, it is important that also governments and leaders, when they're signing on to some of these pledges, that they give a wider guarantee on the protection of the people, indigenous people, and also local communities that live around these places, on how their rights are actually going to be protected, because they are the people that protect the biggest portion of our forest, our natural resources. So they have to be actually part and parcel of the solution, and also recognize that we are doing this for the people in our planet, so it cannot be in any way really affecting the communities that are trying to make their lives better, that are trying to find food and water for their families. It's supposed to be working together with the communities without really in any way interfering with their rights.
If I could just add to that. Mostly when we're talking about reforestation, it's because we've lost the forest, and so those indigenous people have already lost their, you know, kind of their bank, their hospital, their natural capital. If you look across West Africa, where we've lost most of the forest, the rivers have dried up. If you look at Costa Rica, when Costa Rica got down to about 20% forest cover and their rivers stopped flowing, that was when they took the decision to regrow their forests, and they're back up to about 57, 58% today. So there's a huge need across the forest belt of Africa, but also going into the drier forests, the savannas, to restore ecosystems. And if we manage to do that, that restores the quality of life of the people that are living there. Before I lived in Gabon and became Gabonese, I worked in Sierra Leone. Beautiful country, 2/3 rainforest. Well, the forest communities that I worked with in the early 80s, today are sending their kids 10 kilometers walk to collect water because they lost the forests and the ecosystem services. And there, we desperately need to replant with the people, not against the people, with the people, to restore the systems that have been degraded. And Red Plus, the plus in Red Plus, which often gets, I assume I'm talking to, at least some of you are kind of Red Plus experts and so on. That plus is the bit that the developed world tends to brush aside. So how many carbon credits have you been given? I don't know how many trees you've planted. You'll probably tell me you've planted like 1 million trees or something. But how many carbon credits has your organization received for all of those trees you planted?
No.
Lots?
No.
None?
None.
None. Well, how is that possible? When they plant trees in Norway, they claim CDM credits, and they backdated them to 2013 in the Paris Agreement by bullying us. Mm-hmm. And you didn't get any carbon credits for all those trees that are growing thanks to your efforts.
Great.
That's what we need to change.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Lee, and thank you, Elizabeth. It was great having you here today. This was a very thought-provoking conversation.